Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I wanted to share with you a short Torah. It's really on Parshat VaYigash, which was last week's Torah portion, and it's the Torah that I offered in Shul for those who were able to make it. But it also, of course, is connected to this week's Torah portion, which speaks about a grandfather, Yaakov, giving blessings to his children and his grandchildren. And that's really the theme that I want to speak about. I also want to mention and express thanks to Rabbi Yitzchak Goodman, whom a lot of what I'm going to share with you, certainly some of the best stuff that I'm going to share with you, are from his book. So let's begin with a question that actually Rabbi Goodman tells the story about with regards to the Kutzker Rebbe. There was a person who approaches the Kutzker Rebbe and he says to him that my children are neglecting me. They're not so interested. They don't have great compassion for me. What's going on? And the Kutzker responded to him and says, actually, that's the way of the world. And we actually learn it from this week's Parsha, VaYigash, when Yehuda makes the argument to Yosef, who, of course, he doesn't yet know that he's Yosef, and he makes the argument that he should release Binyamin, their brother, because if you don't release him, our father, Yaakov, is going to die of grief. It would just be too devastating if I don't bring Benjamin back with me, argues Yehuda to Yosef. And the Kutzker points out and says, wait a second. We learn later in this week's Torah portion that Binyamin has 10 children. Why doesn't Yehuda make the argument and says, listen, if you don't allow Binyamin to go free, he's going to have 10 children who are going to be crying and filled with grief, and they'll be devastated as well. Why does he say, no, it's the father who will die of grief? What about the 10 children? So the Kutzker points out, it says, listen, the way of the world is that a parent mourns much more so for their child, God forbid, than if they look to the previous generation, than a child would mourn for a parent. And certainly if you've ever been to a Shiva house, after a family has lost a parent or an elderly grandparent, of course, it's incredibly sad. And there's a lot of loss there, but there's also a lot of positive memories. And if you contrast that with going to a shiva where a parent has lost a child, you really feel the difference. Losing a child is it's hard to compare griefs, but it's certainly sometimes an even more inconsolable type of experience. So that's the Kutzker's point. And the Pardes Yosef goes a step further and says this entire concept of, in a sense, mourning more for a child than a parent actually is in humanity's DNA. It starts at the very beginning of creation, with the creation of Adam Harishon, the very first human being, Adam and Chava. Because after all, Adam and Eve, they had, of course, the Creator. They had God as their parent, but they didn't have human parents. And so therefore they never developed the sense of compassion one would have for parents, but rather they had to develop it only for children. And it's an interesting idea, and I think it perhaps explains Judaism's incredible concern with orphans. If we view Adam and Chava almost as orphans without parents, right? That's in part of Judaism's concern in every generation for the need and concern of orphans. And I don't want to read too much into the Pardes Yosef's interpretation, but I think we can even say something more. And that is this. You know, I've always wondered, how is it possible that Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, could sin? I mean, they're talking directly with God, with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. How could they possibly have sinned? It doesn't make sense at all. But if we realize that they lacked parents who guided them in the process and their relationship with God, perhaps it becomes a little bit more understandable. Perhaps that's at the root of their initial sin, is that they didn't benefit from guidance from a previous generation. And therefore what we learn from this, of course, is the obligation of parents and grandparents to be able to share their knowledge with the subsequent generations as a way of helping them in their relationship with God. And I think, in fact, we can see this just a verse or two later, when Yehuda confronts Yosef, and he says to him, you know, if I don't bring up the na'ar, the youth, right? How can I go up to my father? It's referring to Yaakov. V'hanar eineni iti, and the youth is not with me. How can I possibly do that? So, of course, there's a few different ways of understanding the confrontation between Yehuda and Yosef. One of them is just this confrontation between two human beings, two brothers. The other is on a national level. Yehuda represents the Jewish people. Yosef, at this point in time, represents Mitzrayim, Egypt, and it's a conflict between these two nations and these two ways of looking at the world. But you can also view it on a spiritual level, and that's what the Torah wants to do. And he says what Yehuda is really saying to Yosef is as follows: Ech ani e'eleh, how will I go up? Going up in this regard, he's saying, is after I have passed away and after I have died, and I go up to visit Avi, my father, Avinu Shabashamayim, my father in heaven. I'm now in Olam Haba, the next world, and I have a gathering, a meeting with God. How can I possibly go up to God and defend myself if the youth is not with me? And in this regard, the youth is not specifically Binyamin, but all youth. If I have not shared that knowledge that I have with the next generation and somehow help guide them along to help them in their relationship with God, with other people, with their standing in the world, with community, right? That's part of my obligation, is to share that which I have with the Na'ar. Specifically, it could be his own children, his brother, but of course it's a generational thing as well. With all the youth, that's my obligation. I remember when my father, Zichron Livracha, retired, he began to think that his entire mission now was no longer about building his career, focusing on his particular life, but rather transmitting that which he had benefited and gained over a lifetime of wisdom and sharing that with his grandchildren. So, for example, even though it was just him and my mother living at home, he chose not to have a small car, but rather he ended up going out and buying an 8-seater minivan. And then he offered all the parents of his grandchildren, meaning his children, my siblings, he offered all of them that he would pick up and drive to all series of different events, to school, drop them off, pick them up, and take them to after-school activities and sporting events and things along those lines, that he would always be willing to take them. And indeed, that's what he did. He would run around. I have 3 siblings, and they have a number of different children, that he would always race around and spend a good portion of his days carpooling. But of course, he viewed that time with the grandchildren as a very special time, not just to connect with them, but really also to be part of their education and to share with them. And he found it a wonderful opportunity. It was almost like a subversive measure that the parents thought they were getting a benefit in terms of just having someone physically pick up their children, and they had a little more free time. But really, his motivation was not to give them that benefit, but to give them the benefit of their wisdom. And he spent a tremendous amount of time and investment in order to do that. And when I see these grandchildren, in fact, and I see my father in them as well, because he really focused and invested on the relationship and invested in guiding them to what is important in life. And particularly, he focused a lot on Judaism and love of Israel and ethics between people, and you see the results in that regard. And so I think part of the message we hear in this week's Torah portion is Yehuda is saying to all of us, those of us who have children, those of us who have grandchildren, and those who don't have either. But if you've acquired a certain amount of wisdom in your life and you have guidance, don't take it to the grave with you. Make sure you invest the time and the effort to share that with your children, with your grandchildren, with the youth in general, and then you can go up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu clean and proud of all that you have accomplished. Have a Shabbat Shalom.